How many of you felt your mental well-being go up this morning when Health Minister Ong said we need more economists? That definitely was a good signal for me. So today, actually, I'm going to talk about quality of life in the Singapore context. You know, the speaker before me talked about measuring mental well-being for the Singapore context, and it's all relative. So actually, maybe in the Singapore context, I thought maybe one good indicator is whose blood pressure goes up when we hear COE prices. Okay? Because at the end of the day, it's comparing with the Jonases, right? So as part of, I would say, research for this presentation, I did binge watching of this Netflix movie called Live to 100, The Blue Zones. How many of you have watched it? It's very interesting because there's so much advice in there about living to 100 and having a quality of life. First, you have to give up your cars and walk all the time, preferably uphill or upstairs. Secondly, you have to change your diet, go vegan or go vegetarian. Thirdly, you need to have a very good community and connection and a purpose in life. Okay. So what was interesting about this is that the 5 zones that were identified, so-called a blue zone, where they have a lot of people who live to 100 or more years old, this guy, Bildner, actually talked about Singapore being the blue zone 2.0, okay, which is really about the next frontier of aging. So he talked about how our life expectancy has gone up, more than 20 years. We have more people living to 100. And on top of having very high life satisfaction, we have a healthy population, okay? But what was interesting was that he said it was all engineered from policy. Right? So I'm not here to preach why all of you need to watch this Netflix movie, but definitely I think there's some good advice there. But I think it's interesting when we think about quality of life, because we learned from all the previous sessions, it's really not just about the money or the GDP per capita. It's also not about the length of your life. I mean, how many of you looking forward to living to 100? That's actually the wrong question to ask, because it's the quality of life when you live to 100, right? There's no point living to 100 if you're in a wheelchair, right? You want to be healthy. So I think really there's some interesting aspects that we have to consider today. So let me talk a little bit about what is quality of life. What are the definitions of successful life in general? So in the past, those of a certain vintage will remember what are the 5 C's, okay? It used to be cash, car, credit card, condominium, and country club membership. But I think over the years, we have seen a lot of the policymakers try to reshape the conversation, right? So even as recent as 2021, DPM Heng talked about the 3 new C's, right? He was talking about creating value for society, caring for the environment, and charting the way forward. And then more recently, we also had the Forward Singapore report. How many of you have read the Forward Singapore report? Cannot be. This is a whole room full of economists. Only one person put up the hand that he read the Singapore report. And by the way, that's my research assistant, Baxter, who helped me with this presentation. Maybe all of you are very modest. Okay. But generally, I think what was articulated inside the report kind of like tries to move the needle a little bit, basically saying that it's not just GDP alone, it's not just life expectancy alone, it's also a lot of other things that we're trying to measure. So really, at the end of the day, the presumption is that we have quality over quantity. So let me start by sharing with you what the Eurozone and OECD have tried to capture in terms of how they measure quality of life indicators. So they have this 8+1 dimensions. It covers anything from your material living conditions to your productivity, health, education, your leisure and social interactions, the security element, governance, natural living environment, and your overall experience of life. Okay? And I thought what was interesting was that it tries to be fairly comprehensive, very multi-dimensional, but it also talks about trade-offs, right? It's not possible to, have everything, and as we all know in economist terms, there's no free lunch, right? So this morning, even Minister Ong talked about how the iron triangle, right? So this is a snapshot for OECD countries. Who does well in this quality of life indicators and who doesn't do well? And as you would expect, countries, the Nordic countries like Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland do very well on all these dimensions. And then some of the less developed countries fall, on the left side of the spectrum. And then people like the US and the rest are somewhere in between, okay? So what I did, which is really a fairly simplistic approach, really is that we took a couple of the indicators that are in this 8+1 dimension. I think if I were to go into the 8+1 dimension, we'll be here for the rest of the day, okay? Instead of just 25 minutes or so. So what we try and focus on really now is to look at some of the material living conditions, how we rank against the top 3 in the OECD measure, the productive activities, and in terms of economic and physical safety. Okay, so Singaporeans, we like to compare, and we like to compare with the best. So this is what I'm trying to do here. Okay, so if you look in terms of material living conditions, income levels have obviously been growing very, very rapidly. What's interesting is that although on an absolute level we're consuming more, but as a percentage of our personal disposable income, it's actually been falling. In other words, our income growth outstrips our expenditure growth, which is a good thing, right? It's adding to your financial wealth, right? And then obviously you see the 2 bumps in the charts, really that was because of the pandemic. Because of circuit breaker and the lack of travel, people tend to consume less and save more. But you can see that since then, the trend has kind of normalized back. So I think going forward from here, what will be interesting is that, would higher income growth necessarily mean that our well-being improves? And I think the earlier speaker seems to suggest not necessarily. Okay? Then if you look at other conditions, right? In Singapore, we like to think about the size of the house we live in, right? I think the recent 2.8 billion money laundering scandal has kind of like thrown open a glimpse, it's not just crazy rich Asians, but suddenly you realize, wow, this is how some of the really rich people spend their money, right? So I think if we just take it back one step, actually house ownership is very, very high in Singapore, right? And interestingly, if you remember the 5 Cs earlier, people want to live in condos, right? Upgrade from public housing. And actually, if you look at the proportion of people living in condos and other apartments, that has been rising, right? Although those that are living in landed property remains quite stable. But given that we are an aging population, it is very likely that big is not necessarily better, right? Because the policymakers also talk about downsizing. If you are a retiree household, you don't need a lot of space, which is why actually you see for those residents that are aged 65 and above, they tend to be on smaller scale housing. Okay. So that could actually mean that the property mix could actually evolve from here going out. Then in terms of comparing material living conditions with, remember the top 3 countries, Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland, actually our personal disposable income has been growing quite in line with what we see in these very high income countries, okay? But if you look at another side of it, which is really the Gini coefficient, inequality, you can see that there has been improvement over time, but generally, still slightly higher than some of these comparison countries. Then that brings me to the point about productive activities. Labor participation rates in Singapore is very high, right? 2/3 of the residents above the age of 15 are employed, they have a paid job, very close to what we see in the 3 comparison nations. 77% of men are in paid work, a little less for women. So maybe you can say that, well, women participation in paid work has been increasing, but maybe still has a little bit more room to go. And then you look in terms of the unemployment rate, it's very, very low. And I think also there doesn't seem to be a sign that we have structural long-term unemployment, right? In other countries, when they talk about long-term unemployment, it means people who are unemployed for 6 to 12 months. Our median unemployment period here is 8 weeks, right? And then we already know in the Forward Singapore report that they are planning to help some of those who are involuntarily unemployed. Then what about the quality of employment, right? So how many of you wish you can work less hours for better work-life balance? Nobody? Really? Come on, guys. Either you didn't have your coffee during a coffee break or you're not being very truthful here. Okay? But what's interesting is that the effect actually is not linear, right? So if you work up to a certain point, your well-being deteriorates, for example, over 48 hours per week. But actually, in most of the countries that we compare, and also for Singapore, we work less than that. Then this raises the very interesting questions. Why is it that 3 out of 4 Singaporeans are sleep deprived when they are working less hours over time? Okay. Is this social media, Netflix, gaming, or what effect? But, what it also means is that just looking at the hours work doesn't tell you about well-being, although typically work stress, we know, does affect your mental well-being. Okay. So then it comes to the case, at what point actually is quite meaningless to talk about reducing work hours further. It's really more what you do with the hours that you're not working that should matter. Okay. Then moving to my third category that I looked at, which was really economic and physical safety. We know, that wealth has been growing very rapidly in Singapore, right? Household wealth has risen, indebtedness generally is very low. If you look in terms of debt to net worth, it's only 0.14 times in 2023. Household debt, despite rising property prices, compared to personal disposable income, is also falling. It's at 1.3 times. And then maybe you say that, well, for people who are economically active, maybe you feel fairly secure, right? But what if you're retired? Does it mean that you feel less secure about your financial well-being? And then, of course, if you look at the compulsory savings that we have in the CPF system, actually they are ranked fairly highly in the pension systems of the world, right? So then that brings me back to the question, you could have the money you need to have a very decent level of life, but going back to my previous speaker's point, but if people are having a better life compared to you, do you feel better off or not? Right. So it's this idea of keeping up with the Jonases. And I think in Singapore, it is actually a very, very real reality because we see flashy cars on the road, we see people living in GCBs, and we also saw earlier, they don't care whether water price goes up because it doesn't affect them, right? Then, of course, that will bring us to the very interesting question of what about policy interventions, right? And as we know, actually, the low-income and vulnerable Singaporeans get a lot of policy help. In fact, this is what I would call the cradle-to-grave kind of approach. You get everything from childcare to education to job support to housing grants, work fair income supplementary scheme, and so on and so forth, elderly medical care, etc., etc. And in fact, the government keeps topping up the assurance package, right? So there are a lot of considerations that are already put in place. Okay. I won't ask how many of you qualify for any of these packages here. Okay. But I do know that with the Majula package, there is this new term coined, young senior. Okay. It's a bit of a strange concept, okay, but we have to face it. Okay. It's all relative. So I think in terms of physical safety, it's quite clear. Singapore, you feel safe. You go walk at night alone, especially if you're female, you don't worry about it at all. We take it for granted. Perceptions of safety also very, very high. So I think as far as this element is concerned, we actually do very, very well. Okay. But now I want to stop short of all the comparisons and take a look at two other perspectives. Okay. One is this recent study by NTU and the LKY Public Policy School. Some of you may have read it as well, when they talk about the minimum income standard. Okay. And the report suggests there are some gaps in the current retirement income protection system. Okay. So basically they said that, well, actually, to live well or a minimum income level, and they worked out some of the sums here depending on whether you have a partner, are you living in a single person household, etc., etc. So some of the recommendations of this report is that you need a universal wage floor to help the low wage workers and some of the other reforms that are needed, right? But universal wage floor or minimum wages is something that's quite unwelcome to policymakers. Okay, they can call it something else, but you cannot be minimum wage. All right. So if you look in terms of the response, I think the quibble really was, what is minimum income needed? So, they said, well, actually, it's more to do with what you need to have a sense of belonging, respect, security, independence. So if you need jewelry, you need perfume, you need to go on overseas holidays, these are wants. They are not needs per se, okay? So I think that was one of the quibble. And second point, they said, well, actually, they don't think that universal wage floor is the best way to achieve this. So in policy talk, progressive wage model, better lah, okay? But my point really is that actually with time, aspirations have changed. What people perceive as needs or wants is very, very different. I can tell you that my kids think a smartphone is their basic right from a very, very young age. How many of you have teenagers who feel that way, right? It doesn't matter, I tell them. When I was your age, I never had a phone, much less a smartphone. It's something that's completely alien to them, right? So similarly in schools, having laptops, having iPads is the norm, all right? So actually with time and with society change and maturing, the definition of what is a want or need will evolve. And then depending, of course, whether you're economically active or you're a retiree or you fall into a vulnerable segment of society, your perception of what is necessary would also be different from others, okay? So let me talk a little bit about this recent survey that was done. Basically, they wanted to capture pre-COVID and post-COVID perceptions of their quality of life, right? So, of course, this was meant, I think, if I could say it rather cheekily, is to show that the government has done a good job over the pandemic. But I did find some interesting insights in this survey results as well, okay? So, if you look at the percentage of people who rated their quality of life worse, it's 28%. Okay? Then if you delve a little bit deeper, it's not that they feel that everything has deteriorated. They did still at least rate 6 out of these 10 aspects the same or better compared to pre-COVID. But what was really interesting is that for the youth, they really lament the loss of relationships with friends and also the ability to pursue things that they like, okay? So I know this for a fact because I had teenage kids who missed out on prom, they didn't get orientation in person when they went to university, all the things that they took for granted that are actually quite important milestones in our life. So they did miss out on a certain part of, the transitions in life, okay? So to them, this is what's important, right? So when you talk about quality of life for the younger generation, they may be very different and it may not really focus on material things like money or income. A lot of it has to do with connection with their friends, ability to do things within a community. Then the other point really is that for respondents with multiple dependents, their perception of quality of life has also shifted, right? So now more of them are likely to rate their quality of life as poor or very, very poor, right? So this is about 18% or so. And this really means that when we talk about quality of life discussions, actually it's very hard to generalize across the board. You do need to look at the different segments. They have different priorities. And if you are in what policymakers like to call the middle class squeeze, or you have dependents who are young and old, your perception of well-being could be very, very different. Okay? And then of course, if you are unemployed, you would also feel very differently about your well-being, right? So I think some of these challenges are actually being addressed in the Forward Singapore conversation. But I wanted to share with you also, okay, if you look at the household survey, that the Department of Stats conducts, right? Interestingly enough, we all know we are an aging population, right? Number of people aged 65 continues to grow, right? So although if you look at household income from work, it seems to be going up, right? But if you look at how the trends are playing out in the elderly in Singapore, it does show some room where policy interventions will continue to play a big role. So if you are a single person household and you are elderly, you probably need a lot more intervention. If you fall in the category that you're unable to perform or you perform with a lot of difficulty in at least one basic activity, your well-being also completely changes. So no point living to 100 if you're not healthy and able, right? So I won't bore you guys too much with what's said in the Forward Singapore, but you should read it at the very least, right? Because this is going to affect policy for the next few years, if not the decades to come. But what is interesting is that there is a very clear acknowledgement that what constitutes a good life has now evolved beyond the material goods. So they also talk about the 5 C's. Now they mean that you need to have meaning and purpose in what you do. So that actually kind of brings me back to my first slide, which was on the blue zone, okay? Because out of the 5 places that they highlighted, in Okinawa, the Japanese people talk about ikigai. In Costa Rica, the Nicoyans talk about plan de vida, but basically it's your purpose. Why do you get up every morning? Okay? What drives you? Right? The whole point is that you live longer, but you must have a purpose, and that is what you enjoy doing, and that's really what drives your well-being. Okay? So I will end by sharing with you some of my key takeaways, and hopefully provide some food for thought for the panel discussion, right? So if you think about material quantitative type of indicators, Singapore has done very well, right? But a lot of these socio-economic targets, I think, will continue to evolve. Quality of life discussions really differs from individual to individual. You do need to break down to age groups, and I think there has to be a recognition that it changes over time. We cannot ignore and say, well, that's just a want, not a need. Because I think the lines are clearly blurring, okay? But the question is, how do you bridge that gap, or at least narrow that gap a little bit? What came out quite clearly in the Singapore Forward report is that the policy approach here is that they will not leave it to market forces. They will intervene, okay? And part of this intervention really is because they want to build a new social compact for a more inclusive and fairer society. So I had a question, which is, so far we have so-called made it into the Blue Zone 2.0. Will we make it into the Blue Zone 3.0? Okay. The little symbol picture there is not mine. It's taken from the Forward Singapore report. They seem to be pretty optimistic and confident they will make it. So I leave you with that. But for any of you that are interested, please do sign up to our Telegram channel. Thank you.